Hi everyone! Our learning outcomes for Unit 6 include: we will analyze the Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain around the 1760s, the middle of the 18th century, and we will talk about the time period of the Industrial Revolution until the beginning of World War I, until 1914. And we will assess several things: why it began in Europe, specifically Britain, as opposed to somewhere like China or India, where they were very advanced comparatively. Why did it happen in Europe? And why Britain specifically? We will also talk about and assess the influences of some of the new technologies on jobs. How did new technologies affect people's work and their lifestyle and their health and transportation, means of getting from place to place? And we'll also talk about the effects on the masses of people, namely the workers, the working class people, socially, financially, physically, how it affected them, their bodies and their health, and emotionally. And all of these things together has a really big effect on the workers of the world. And of course, we'll have to touch upon the environment. We'll assess the effects of the Industrial Revolution on the environment, and we'll see how things like coal did a lot of damage to the air and water and land of the world. Our IDs, as always, are in the beginning of the PowerPoints. The IDs, map IDs, and the timeline events. And our focus question. So the focus question for this week is to explain, first of all, what was going on during the Industrial Revolution. I'd like you to think about the many ways new inventions affected people, things that we just talked about, and we'll delineate or assess or describe these things in more detail during this lecture, and how the new working and living conditions affected the people. And here's your argument. This is what you are supposed to look at to argue in your outline, in your paper. Why was the new philosophy of socialism based around Marxism incited or provoked? And a hint is for you to think about how the changes in inventions, job types, working conditions, living conditions, health, etc. affected the working class people, the proletariat. And I would like you to include an assessment of either the Communist Manifesto or one of our primary source images, Pyramid of the Capitalist System. You can assess both if you'd like, and you should also pick at least one more primary source document and at least one more image to analyze in your argument. Okay, so think about this. Why did the Industrial Revolution begin in Europe, and specifically Britain? Okay, so why Europe? Was it predestined? Was Europe just meant to be? Did God decide that Europeans are superior people and therefore should initiate the Industrial Revolution, propelling Europeans to the forefront of the world to make them the most powerful and most special and most wonderful compared to everybody else in the entire world? No, definitely not. It was not predestined, as most of us would understand. The Chinese were way more advanced in so many ways. The Indian sphere of the world was way more advanced, and the Islamic world, in regard to technology, science, and economics, the easterly the easterly regions of the Eastern Hemisphere were very, very well advanced. So we can't really say that Europe was just meant to be the leader of the Industrial Revolution, because if you were to look at things in the 15th and 16th centuries, you wouldn't perhaps think that that would be the case, especially prior to then. Well, in Europe, there is what is called restless creative merchant freedom. After a lot of wars, European wars, especially religious wars between different sects of Christianity and between other regions, between kings and merchants, things are starting to settle down, and without the warring, without an interfering outside push and an outside focus of getting the other guy, people start to get a little bit of restlessness, and they want to be creative and they want to build things. And the merchants have a lot of freedom as compared to other parts of the world. In China, merchants don't really have freedom to do and build things that they want. Everything is based on Confucian philosophy, which is filial piety, which means there's a very strict social structure, and everyone has to kind of get permissions to do things. Same for the Islamic world. There's the Quran and madrasas. Madrasas are the kind of universities where people would study the Quran, and there are other things being studied, but it's definitely under the guise, under the rule of the Islamic philosophies. So in Europe, there's a lot more freedom for merchants to kind of explore and build and do. There is also that long-term competition in Europe, and this goes hand in hand with the merchant freedom. The long-term competition comes from those great wars in Europe, the 100 Years' War, the War of the Roses, the 30 Years' War, all of these great wars. And now after the Peace of Westphalia, where the European regions are kind of broken down, and people decide that whatever the kingdom is can decide their own religion. They are no longer warring against each other, but this turns into competition. And competition to improve and become wealthier and more powerful and more influential over the world. There are also state merchant alliances, and this leads to innovation and commerce. A state merchant alliance would mean that a government would need money, and a merchant that becomes very wealthy can loan the government money. And so the merchant loans the government money, and the government decides to protect the merchant with perhaps military to ensure that the merchant's goods can be traded safely. And the merchant, by loaning the state money, ensures that that merchant will be the only one to sell whatever product it is, giving that merchant a sort of monopoly over his products. And I say his because throughout history there aren't women businesses for the most part, so it's easy to say his. And this leads to innovation and a free enterprise for commerce, a free route for commerce to exchange. And a lot of people can feel the need to build and innovate because they have the support of the government behind them. Another reason is competition with Asian imports. Again, everything from Asia is wonderful, and it is challenging to compete with goods that come so cheaply from the East and are such better quality. So it's a necessary thing for Europeans to attempt to save money in the manufacturing and in the labor processes of creating these items. So that's a good reason for people to start building new technologies to try to make things easier and more efficient and better produced. Additionally, Europeans have access to goods, raw materials in particular, that come from the Americas. Minerals and other types of metals that are mined in the Americas, and other foodstuffs. So the population grows and people are getting healthier in Europe because of that, because of all of the potatoes and turkeys and whatever else, corn, all the good stuff that comes from the Americas. Okay, so why Britain? Why in all of Europe is Britain the one to be the most successful, the earliest on? So first of all, stable British laws. The laws are old, and the rules are for everybody involved, and it's stable. And when things are stable, people can invest and don't worry. They don't have to worry that the government is going to collapse, or that someone else is going to take over, or that the government is going to take their stuff. So with these stable British laws, merchants and inventors feel more at ease to develop their goods without worrying that someone else is going to take it. The British are also very religiously tolerant and welcoming to other diverse people. Now, this isn't to say they're standing at the borders with signs saying, "Welcome, join us," but compared to other parts of the world and other parts of Europe, the British are much more gentle and welcoming and kind to other people, especially refugees. One really big example of this are Jewish people who were escaping pogroms from the East, from Russia in particular. A pogrom is a government-sanctioned mass riot where the government, the police know that the rioters are going to go attack someone, and they either do nothing or they even encourage people to go. And why were the Jews targets? We'll talk about this more later, but basically they're seen as a different group of people, and anything that's different is bad. And so the Jews are persecuted pretty severely in Russia, and they flee, they run, literally run across the land, and end up going to Britain because they feel the least threatened there, the most welcome there as compared to other parts of Europe or the Eastern Hemisphere. The cottage industry. Britain has what is called the cottage industry, and basically it's sort of like a blueprint for a factory assembly line. And we don't really have a full assembly line until Ford creates one in the early 1900s for his cars. But the cottage industry is basically like a bunch of cottages, a bunch of houses with families, and each family has their farm and they grow whatever it is that they grow. And then at night they're all sitting around a candle perhaps, and they have nothing to do and they're bored, and or maybe not bored, maybe they're just whatever, doing whatever, but this allows them to produce part of something. So say we're going to make a shoe. The first house would cut the soles of the shoe, and then the second house would take the soles and punch holes in the soles of the shoe, and the third house would sew the sole to other parts of leather to help create the form of the shoe, etc. So we would take maybe 10 houses to create one product, and each family, each cottage, each house would be paid by piece. So you cut one sole of a shoe and you get paid a tenth of a penny or whatever it is at the time. And eventually you end up with a full product down the line. Now this is helpful for people who are sitting around a fireplace, they don't have much to do after work, and they want to make it some extra money. And it's helpful for the owners of the shoe production line because they get a whole bunch of different families to make the different parts of the products, and some people put them together, etc. And so we're seeing a sort of blueprint, like a diagram for the idea of an assembly line to come. And assembly lines are very, very efficient. You do not have to be an expert. Anyone can do the job. It's very monotonous. We'll talk more about assembly lines soon. And then geographic luck. Britain has some extraordinary luck when it comes to the stuff that is in the earth and underneath the people. So first of all, there's a whole lot of iron. Iron is used to produce steel, and steel is one of the strongest metals of the world. And it is very useful to build things out of steel. It is just so much better compared to so many of the other metals that people had been working with prior to this. And people have to be really careful with steel production because if iron isn't smelted properly, it can crack and become very brittle and turn into what is called pig iron, where a lot of nails are made of pig iron. But steel is just an incredible tool that a lot of machines end up being built out of in the Industrial Revolution. Britain also has an abundance of coal. Coal is used, you light a coal and it gets really hot. It's used to heat things, to melt things like iron into, smelt it into steel. And also coal is used to heat water to create pressure to put force and energy into things like steam engines. So coal is really important. And then water. Britain is a big island and there are lots of waterways within Britain, and then the people managed during the Industrial Revolution to figure out how to make canals that connect parts of the country together, parts of the territory together, and this allows for really easy travel. Things float on water, so people would put a whole bunch of stuff on a barge, on a piece of wood basically, and float it down the river being led by a couple donkeys. And it was really made life a lot easier and a lot cheaper to move goods from one part of the region to the next. This is an in-close look at the major industrial areas in Britain, and you can see them in green, and then the red dots are coal fields. They look like teeth to me. They're coal fields, and you can see that they're just kind of smothering England. And then the X's are iron ore fields, so again, lots of iron in Britain. And then what's perhaps most important are those yellow railroad lines, and that's by 1850. So within a very short period of time, the whole country is connected, in a sense, by railroad. And railroads, of course, are important because goods can be transported extremely quickly, much faster than by foot or donkey or horse. And even faster than water, and in both directions. And this is a sort of zoomed out image, so you can see how smothered England is with those railroad lines and how much industry there is within just that tiny little island nation. Okay, why Britain again? Well, the people there, the scientists, are focusing on practical science rather than theoretical science. There's this idea of marriage of science and technology, meaning science gets now blended with the goal of producing machines to help industry evolve. And there's backyard tinkering, and the quote is, out of the ivory towers. The ivory towers are universities. And in other parts of the world, like in France, people are only allowed to build things. They need permits, and so they have to go to one center, one university or one region to get permissions and to make sure that everything is perfect, and it takes so much time. Whereas in Britain, people can go play in their backyard, so to speak, and figure things out, create these tools, create patents for them, spread them, give them to their neighbors, and then there's a lot of production in Britain pretty quickly because of this. A couple examples of this practical application is cotton. First, the flying shuttle. It turns cotton balls into thread, and it starts out being this machine, which is made out of steel, is used first with water power. So the current in a river would be used to move a windmill, which would turn machines. And then it was steam power. So they would burn coal and boil water to create steam, and that would end up making this machine move. So the flying shuttle really is helpful in speeding up the production of thread, of cotton thread, rather than manual wheels, which take a really long time. And then the spinning mule turns thread into cloth. And here's one example of how important these machines were to increasing production. It would take 50,000 human hours to make 100 pounds of cloth. And with the spinning mule, it would only take 300 hours and one human to do this. 50,000 human hours would mean, say, our work week is 40 hours. That would be 40 hours out of 50,000 hours to make 100 pounds of fabric. And here, with the spinning mule, it is reduced to 300 hours, which is pretty phenomenal, extraordinary. What do you think happens to all of those workers who used to be cloth makers, who would take thread and turn them into cloth? All of those people are now unemployed. Pretty painful for a lot of people, and this is just one example of one technological innovation that really improves the speed and creation of one material, one item, cotton and thread and cloth, but you can see how influential this would be on all of industry. I think that's a big reason why a lot of our jobs are in service industry as opposed to in technical creation. Another really big reason is the labor force in Britain. Starting in the 18th century, so starting in the 1700s, there was a great population growth, and part of this was due to the American products like the Peruvian potato that came into Europe. After the Black Plague and after all of those wars, the European wars, population is starting to finally grow, and the foodstuffs that came in from the Americas definitely had a big influence on that. Also in the 17th century, so starting in the 1600s, there was this thing called entail, which is basically small tenant farmers who would have their farms purchased by a big commercial agricultural firm, and they would put a fence around the farm, and rather than farming for something like wheat, the wheat would now be turned into an area for sheep to graze so that people could use the wool of the sheep. And also a whole bunch of small tenant farms would be sold to a big commercial farm, and all of those small tenant farmers would now either have to become renters to the big farmer or would have to leave and move to the city, which is what the majority of farmers did. They moved to cities and they went to work in factories. Okay, so another reason why Britain was the head of the Industrial Revolution is because of capital. Britain had a lot of capital, and capital is really anything that can make money. So a huge labor force is capital, and all of those goods that Britain had, like the iron and the coal, those are all things that can be construed as capital. And they also had credit. There was a long tradition of those joint stock companies like the English East India Company, the EEIC. We also had aristocratic lenders, meaning the nobility would lend money to both merchants and vendors and the government. So there's a lot of loans. And then there were banks that started to just loan money to people, both to the government and to businesses. And that credit is really important because most people don't have an abundance of cash laying around where they can buy a machine. And if someone has a machine that can make your business a lot of money, but you don't have the cash up front, you definitely need a loan so that you can purchase that machine to make all of that extra money and extra goods. So here is kind of just a rundown of that list of why Britain. Okay, so what were the major global consequences of the Industrial Revolution? And we're going to talk about some more of the new inventions, the new environment, meaning how the Industrial Revolution affected the environment, the world, and then how there were new living and working conditions for the people. And this again led to new philosophies, new ways of thinking about the world. Why are we, the workers, being held down in such terrible working conditions when our bosses are living the good life and abusing us? Why is this happening? So first of all, some of the major effects on the environment. A lot of the renewable energies that had been used through millennia, like human power, we have muscles and we use them in the past for many thousands of years, and animal power as well, water power, where with the current can be taken and used to produce energy, and wind power with windmills, and wood, which perhaps isn't the greatest renewable energy to burn and produce things and out of wood, but you can plant trees and regenerate forests within, a few decades. So wood is one of those objects. And then non-renewable started to be used. Oil, coal, and gas, and all of these, we just use them and they're gone, and eventually will come a time when there is no more oil or coal or gas to be used from the earth, and we will have to be forced to find other means like solar power, for example. We also created chemicals, and this is fertilizer to make things grow bigger and better, pesticides to keep bugs and animals away from our food, and refrigeration. And now refrigeration is really important because it allows goods to move from one part of the world to the next without rotting, like meat and foodstuffs. So refrigeration is really important, and especially when we put a refrigerator onto a train, we can get goods from one side of the world to the next pretty quickly, or one side of certain parts of the world to the next. But of course, chemicals are a huge toll on the environment. Both fertilizers and pesticides cause a lot of damage and are basically poisons. Pesticides prevent bugs and animals from eating food, and humans take those foods and still eat them, and perhaps we wash the foods off, but really the only way to get clean, good foods is to not have pesticides or fertilizers that are inorganic, and instead to just buy organic goods. And if you look at the studies conducted based on people eating chemically produced foods versus organic, non-GMO, non-genetically modified foods. The health of the blood and the white blood cells are very, very high in people who only eat organic as compared to pesticides and other chemicals. The landscape was altered. Mining, basically you cut down mountains, and in order to mine and cut down mountains, you have to cut down forests. Forests are also cut down to build things like industries and to make space for products and buildings and to use the wood for fire. And all of both mining and deforestation causes an extraordinary amount of pollution, and in general where the pollution goes is into the skies and into the waters, into the air and water that people are breathing in and drinking from and bathing in. And so people are really getting a lot of toxins as compared to prior to the Industrial Revolution. And all of this also leads to urbanization. That means people are moving away from rural farm areas, from open spaces, and moving into urban areas like cities, where there are a lot of people living in a small space. And until we have created things like indoor plumbing and sanitation, people are just throwing their trash outside. The sewage systems are open and running right into the water where people are drinking from and bathing. And that, along with all of the toxic chemicals that come from mining and deforestation, which also, when you cut down forests, it ends up eroding the topsoil. And without topsoil, things don't stay in place. And if there's a big rain, then it just floods the territory because there's nothing to suck down the water or to hold things in place. And all of the topsoil just goes away and becomes a big, muddy, gross mess. And a lot of people end up suffering. And all of these things lead to great pollution in the air, in the rivers, and on the land, in the form of smoke, sewage, and toxic waste. And it's pretty extraordinary to see how much waste we have created. This is one image, and it is shows the effects of industrialization on the environment and on the labor force. It is a Wales copper foundry in the 19th century. This is in Britain. And you can see on top, it's just a bunch of smokestacks. And kind of in the bottom, in the middle, you see some people, but if you don't look carefully, they kind of just blend in with the background. The artist was trying to show how insignificant the people were and how much pollution there was, just piles and piles of coal and grossness, and it's right along the river, which is kind of dark in color. The skies are black, there are smokestacks everywhere and cranes, and it's all about industrialization, and it's all about money. This graph shows the carbon dioxide emissions, and this is in the United States in the 19th and 20th centuries, so the 1800s and 1900s. You can see in the 1800s down here, there is very, very low pollution, and starting around 1870-ish, when the Industrial Revolution starts to happen, it starts in Britain, but it moves towards the United States. Well, it starts in Britain in the 1770s, 1780s, 1760s, but by the time the United States hits, it goes up and up and up and up and up, and this black line shows the total amount in 1,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide. So 100 and, let's see here, 1.6 million thousand metric tons of carbon is being emitted, and this is by 2010. Which is an extraordinarily high number. Scientists, and I'm sure you can find people who disagree with this, but scientists would say that the increased carbon dioxide affects the climate, affects the ocean acidity, how acidic the ocean is, which if that changes too much, fish die, and other environmental factors like the cleanliness of the air, oxygen that we breathe, etc. This is pretty devastating to the earth, and we are not respecting the earth as we should, and we're starting to pay for it with higher rates of things like cancers. We'll see what happens in the next 100 years. I hope this goes back down by a lot. Other major consequences of the Industrial Revolution, the higher classes. What happens to the higher classes? Well, the landowners, as a shock, I know, they remain wealthy and powerful. I know how shocking that must seem to you. Um, Nothing changes. However, there is new middle class that arises with urban wealth. Mainly these people are bankers, industrialists, and entrepreneurs. We call them middle class, even though money standards would make them higher upper class. We call them middle class because they didn't have the social status that the old landowners had of the past. And then there is a new group of lower middle class people, and this is a new position with these so-called desk jobs: teachers, lawyers, salespeople, managers. And these lower middle class people don't make as much money, or don't make that much more than the very lower class people that the working class people make, but socially they are much higher on a social level. Samuel Smiles wrote a self-help book in regard to thrift. We're also going to read his poem Thrift in class, but basically his philosophy, being a middle class person, says that the lower class is lower class because they spend their money frivolously, they don't save, they buy things like alcohol, and they spend their money without saving properly, and they don't work hard enough. And if they worked hard enough, then they would not be in that lower class position. Of course, that is not the case for 99% of the people who are definitely extremely hardworking. And if you read the primary source documents, you already know that that's the case. Higher classes. The higher class women should be respectable by staying home, not by working, and they're supposed to have a servant to show how respectable and upper class that they are, and their job is to be a consumer. They're supposed to go and buy stuff, and that will help the capitalist world go round, because they buy stuff, money comes into the system, and then money can be spent on paying things like employers. So it's really up to women to become consumers, and this is where we see a really big push towards the importance of stuff for more people, for a middle class person. And if you're a lower class person, of course you want to be like a upper class person, and therefore you want that stuff too. And then we come to the laboring classes. Who are the laboring classes? They are landless wage workers. We're talking about 70+% of the people in Britain. The laboring classes live in cities mostly, but also in towns and villages, and they work in factories, in mines, and generally in big farms where they are little unimportant people who do one specific job and are so invaluable that if they died, it's not a problem for the owners because there are other people who can replace them really, really quickly. It's not specialized jobs for the most part. Starting in the early 19th century, so the early 1800s, women start to work in factories and in the domestic sphere as servants for other people. And we're talking about the laboring classes, or the lower class, to put it in other terms. We also have children, boys and girls, who are starting to work in factories as well. And what's interesting about this is that the types of jobs change. We've always had boys and girls working from a young age. When people had farms, they would have lots of extra children to have extra hands on the farm. So that's nothing new, but for the first time, children are working now in factories, and factory life is much different than working on a farm. Immigrants are also part of the laboring classes. Even if an immigrant were to come in with a high degree of education as a doctor or a lawyer, they would still likely become a landless wage worker, working in any job that they could possibly find that really most people could do, because it doesn't take specialized work or specialized education to take these types of factory jobs. Just a few images here. These are women in a factory. And these are children and young women doing labor. You can see an overseer right in the middle. This is a black and white picture that was colored. It was painted, which I think is kind of interesting to think about. It's so silly to paint a picture, but this definitely helps us understand and feel like we were there as opposed to a black and white picture, perhaps. You can see the youth of this girl, who I assume is around 10 or 12 years old. A bunch of kids in factories, or in a factory. You could tell that they are not exactly enjoying themselves. And kids at this age, for the most part, don't have this type of sad grimace on their face, for the most part, when taking a picture at least. Okay, so what was going on in the Industrial Revolution for the working classes, for the laboring classes? Well, new, very harsh working conditions. First of all, constant supervision and surveillance. And this basically means that a manager would be walking around watching over people as they worked. And that could leave a very unsavory feeling for the workers. They're constantly being watched. It's a frustrating feeling. It gives people kind of a sense of anxiety, and it's not a good place to have a good time and enjoy life and enjoy working. And there were no worker protections. So first of all, they were extremely dangerous conditions. Working in mines today are really, really dangerous still. Mines collapse. One recently collapsed a few years ago and trapped a whole bunch of people inside. And back in the day, there were very few mechanisms to make sure people were safe. Indoor factories had a lot of challenges, very few windows, not proper lighting, doors were locked, and the machines were very, very hazardous. So just the conditions were very, very challenging for the people. There weren't labor practices to ensure safety, and doors were locked. So what does that mean? The managers didn't want people to steal things, and they didn't want people going on breaks, so they literally locked the doors. So say there was a fire, which happened many, many times, people were trapped inside and either jumped out of windows to their deaths or were burned to death. One occasion happened in the early 1900s, and a bunch of girls, basically young immigrant girls, were in a factory for shirts, a shirtwaist factory, and they ended up jumping to their deaths from the 13th and 14th stories, and they were working on a Sunday where most people were out and about having a jolly old time, and so it was publicized because so many people were there watching these young girls jump to their deaths. Some held hands and jumped, and some just were silent, and some screamed, and they tried to catch the girls, but they couldn't, and so many people died, and it was just because the doors were locked. There were no proper fire escapes. The fire escape that was there collapsed, and this happened again and again and again. And even recently this happened in the United States. There was a chicken factory fire, and the doors were locked. I don't know, maybe people thought they were going to steal chickens. I have no idea why the doors were locked, but a lot of people ended up dying, and this was within the last 10 years in the United States. So this still are a lot of challenges that need to be dealt with. And then the hours. We complain about an 8 or 9 hour workday, but really, oh my goodness, the people, I don't know how they dealt with this. 6 days a week they worked for about 15 hours a day, and this was dependent upon the season. So sometimes it was only 13 hours a day, sometimes it was more, 16 plus hours a day. Very few breaks. You didn't get bathroom breaks, and there wasn't a mandatory lunch break, and there wasn't a mandatory whatever break. You worked until your boss said to stop and go home. And that just led to a lot of challenges physically and mentally for a lot of these workers. And there's no insurance. So if a mine collapsed, if a machine took off a toe or took your finger, or you stabbed yourself, or whatever it was, for accidents in the job or outside, or illness, or if there was a recession and unemployment because of too many workers, there was no insurance. So you didn't get any money, there was no welfare, and people literally were starving on the street and dying on the street, could not feed their families, and that's it. That's it. It was just based on the workers and how many workers there were. We're going to talk about the primary source poem, the primary source document, Only a Weaver in Class, and it just shows the vicissitudes of the market and the challenges that workers faced based solely on if there were jobs or not. As an adjunct instructor, I feel that. Personally, I'm dealing with this myself, and I get classes based on how many students there are. If there are more students, then there are more classes available, and I can get full-time work, not considered tenured as a part-timer, but I can teach more. Whereas this semester, one of my classes was canceled because there weren't enough students. So I definitely feel this as well. But back in the day, there were even bigger challenges for more people. I am not going to complain by any means. A few more images. You can see the age of these kids. They are very young kids, and they perhaps should not be working. And these are child mill workers, so they're working in a mill, and their hours and days are extraordinary. And people started at the age of 6. And I know we are in kindergarten and in first grade at age of 6, and it's just unreal to think that these kids are in mines, breathing in the coal and the dust and having major injuries happen on a regular basis, not getting education, not getting taken care of. They are nothing to their employers because they are just there to make money. Another picture of miners. Ha ha. This is an image of someone in a mine, and you can see why children would be so useful in this type of job, because the hole is very small, and so children can pull and crawl through the mines much easier as compared to an adult. This kid is replacing bobbins, which are like pieces for spools for thread, and he's barefoot, and I just see his toes getting caught in the thread and getting his toes pulled off. It's just such a horrifying image to me, and this is totally normal. He's not even wearing shoes. And these kids, one of them is also not wearing shoes in the front, and the guy in the back has his jaw bandaged together. So clearly he was in some sort of accident, and still, even though he's a kid, is still working with his jaw taped together. More factory workers. In this case, there's a lot of lighting because there are some good windows here, but in a lot of cases, there's not enough lighting, there's not enough air, there are toxic fumes. If there is too much toxic fume and there's light that comes in a certain angle, something can catch on fire, and boom, everyone is dead because the doors are locked. Imagine having to go to the bathroom. You need to ask 75 people to get out of your way. It's a very uncomfortable situation here for a lot of people. Okay, so along with all of those other challenges, these workers have no rights. There are punishments for not producing enough. There are punishments, physical punishments and abuses for coming in late or not producing whatever it is, whatever the managers feel. They can literally beat up these kids, these workers, and then very, very low pay. And in addition to physical punishments, people can be docked. So if they show up a few minutes late, their manager is going to dock money. And there's constant fear because these workers, there are so many workers, that your job is so valuable to you, you will go through any types of abuses just to ensure that you can keep your job and come home with those few pennies to feed your family some bread. So there's constant fear as well. Really big challenges. We're going to talk about the primary source document Testimony by Elizabeth Bentley. And she is a young girl who works in a factory, and it goes to show some of the things she went through, waking up at crazy hours in the morning to get to work on time, working as hard as she could. She didn't feel hungry because she was working so hard and her food was covered in dust, so her boss ends up throwing her food, her little meager meal, to the pigs. And so she just basically doesn't eat, she doesn't sleep, and she just works all the time. And it's such a sad experience for her. And she sees people getting beaten up all the time for minor issues. And this is an image of a factory and attached to the factory, in a lot of cases, there were dorms, so people didn't have to walk 5 miles or 2 miles to get to work at 4 in the morning. They could live right there, which sounds like a great plan, except for if you are now working in the dorms, you now owe your boss rent, and you're eating his food, so you owe him money for the food, and rather than paying you, he gives you points, and you have to spend those points to survive, and there is a very small chance of you ever getting out of there with any savings at all, because you're constantly needing things like clothing and food and shelter and a bed and sheets and whatever it is. You want a hot shower? Yeah, that's $5, mister. So it's a very hard situation for these workers in this way as well. So maybe a few more images of Industrial Revolution workers. Okay, rapid urbanization. So cities are built really, really quickly, generally right near factories. And these factories and the apartments that are built are not built properly. They are built, say, for 10 families to live in, and instead 40 families are living there. And this leads to high mortality, high death rates. These are some of the major global consequences of the Industrial Revolution. It doesn't just affect people in Britain, but across the globe. One example of the challenges is in Manchester, which is in England. The life expectancy was 20 years old. So in general, people were expected to live until they were 20, and conditions were so bad, the work conditions and the living conditions, the diseases were rampant, and things were so bad that people were expected to die by the age of 20, and so many did. And this is in 1851 we're talking about here. 1 toilet for 40 people, and other sources I've seen say 2 toilets for 250 people. And we're not talking full bathrooms, we're talking toilets. This is just an unreal thing to think about. And chances are, if you're working really, really hard and not eating properly, your stomach has some challenges, and you probably want to go to the bathroom more than a normal person would, and you're in line with 40 other people. Unreal. 6 out of 10 children die before the age of 5 here. And this is just, what a horrifying thing to have to deal with, to undergo as a mother. And that's probably part of the reason why people had so many children, because half of them were dying. Okay, so just to go over capitalism, and what capitalism is classical liberal economics. So here's the circle. There are lots and lots of workers, which means that there are low wages, because if there are tons of workers, I could pay you whatever I want, because if you don't want the job because I'm not paying you enough, you can leave and there are 5 other people to replace you. So if I'm a manager, I can pay you whatever I want. So these low wages lead to really bad living conditions. People are crammed together, they are sharing beds, they are not showering often enough because they don't have time, because they have to go to work, and therefore people end up starving and dying of diseases and of starvation. So a lot of people die, and that leads to less workers. And if there are less workers, then there's more demand for the workers, which means that laborers can say, you need me, I want more money. And that leads to higher wages and better living conditions. And when you have better living conditions and a better life and more food, what do? You have more babies. And more babies means eventually more workers, which means lower wages and lower living conditions, and then bad things happen and people starve and get diseases and die, etc. So this is the sort of circle of the capitalist philosophy, classical liberal economics in regard to capitalism. This image is the urban poor of industrial Britain, and it's called Death's Dispensary, and it says it is open to the poor gratis, free, by permission of the parish, meaning by the permission of the local church. And you can see that these people are gathered around this well, and they are pumping water. But who is pumping the water? Death. Chances are that the water is toxic, because the factories are pumping toxic waste into the factory into the waters upstream, and there is perhaps sewage being spilled into the water. And so these people who are thirsty and need basic needs met, like water to drink, they are literally drinking disease and toxic waste that is coming from the factories that they are being forced to work in just to survive. And chances are there are 3 kids here, Probably 2 of them will not live to the age of 5. Unreal. So what happens? What happens with all of these challenges for these workers? This leads to some social unrest and a lot of protests. There are a lot of different groups and different people who in their own ways try to make things better, to show people, to show those big bosses that they can't treat people this way. The Leads and the Luddites were a few of those people. This image is of Luddites who were smashing a loom. They were smashing the machines, literally going into factories and breaking machines to stop the managers from buying these machines so that the workers would have more jobs and be treated better. Of course, the managers would just go and get more loans to buy more machines. And these Luddites didn't do very much except for slow the process and anger a lot of people. And then there were writers like Charles Dickens who wrote A Christmas Carol. And there's that guy Scrooge who makes things really harsh on the hard on the people and is just a terrible person. And Charles Dickens was just trying to show mainly upper and middle class women who were a lot of his readers how bad the workers had it. And if these upper class and middle class women had empathy for the workers, they would talk to their husbands, and eventually, perhaps, things would change for those workers. There was a lot of social unrest and protest, and part of this was because there was government favoritism towards business owners and not towards workers. And we still see this today in a lot of ways, but what this means is that even if someone is being abused at their job, really physically and psychologically abused, the government would help the business owners and would not listen to the workers and would actually in a lot of cases beat up those workers. So trade unions were considered suspicious but finally made legal in 1824. However, if people were striking, they would get beaten up by police. You weren't allowed to strike. This is kind of amazing to think about, but literally we see there are pictures of girls, young girls, 14-year-old girls who go on strike, and there are police beating these girls up because they are not allowed to strike. They're not allowed to unionize, and they're not allowed to strike. So all of these abuses, all of these challenges lead to the philosophy called socialism, and this is a reaction to the horrible treatment of workers. And the goal of socialism is to have the government help the masses, help the workers, help the lower class proletariats, as opposed to helping the big business owners. The goal for socialists or socialism is for the government to help the workers, help the masses. This image is the socialist outlook, and this is the pyramid of the capitalist system. At the very top, we see big money, and it is followed quickly under by the rulers, and it says, "We rule you." And down here we fool you, and these are the religious leaders who come together with the powerful political leaders to control the people. And down here we have "we shoot at you." There's the military who is protecting both the religious leaders and the political leaders. And then here we have a big, nice, fat, upper class people. "We eat for you." And you can see they are lounging, they're drunk, this guy has got his head down, there's tons of wine, they're having cheers and dressed fancy. And all of this is being held up by the very bottom, by "we work for all and we feed all." All of these workers, and they're being bent down, and they're trying really hard to hold everything up, hold up that pyramid. This poor girl on the bottom is lying on the ground, perhaps she has died. Everyone is bending down and hunched over, and some of these people are standing with their hammer and their shovel, their working tools, staring up going, maybe we should just sort of walk out from underneath this big pyramid, and the whole system would quickly collapse, because without the workers, nothing else would survive. Absolutely nothing. And that's what the socialist world is looking at, the socialist outlook, to say that these workers need to be protected. And without that protection, everything will fall apart. So these workers need to be taken care of a little bit better so that they're not dying, so that they can thrive as well, and at least eat some basic food. A few of the main leaders of the socialist philosophy are Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. There's a picture of them. And they came up with the idea that capitalism and private property are really evil and they divide. So their goal was, in some ways, to get rid of private property, to get rid of capitalism, and to work towards the idea of uniting together where everyone can have at least some basic needs met. Basic food, basic healthcare, basic education for the masses. And they have this idea that capitalism and private property creates a separation between the bourgeoisie, the upper class, and the proletariat, the working class. And the working class needs to unite, workers of the world unite together to rise up, because there are so many more of us than there are of those small bourgeois, the small wealthy people. So the proletariat needs to come together to rise up, to get the government on their side to protect the people. They wrote the Communist Manifesto, and there's a big difference between communism and socialism, but people see the word socialism and freak out. We'll talk a little bit more about this in class, but there's this idea that socialism is evil. We live in a socialist democracy. We have public school education, for example. At least until now we have that. We'll see what happens with this coming administration. But community college classes cost practically nothing for students. It's something like $53 a unit right now, something like that. So $150 for modern world history class. In reality, the cost of the course is upwards of $4,800, $4,800. And the taxpayers and the socialist system that we are in helps subsidize the rest of that money so that all of our students can come to community colleges and get educated without breaking their bank. And I think that's really important. Also, our fire departments are not private. Our police departments are not private. Our libraries are all public. All of these public services are all part of socialist philosophy. So we are definitely in a socialist democracy, but people hear that word and freak out. So don't be scared, people. Learn before you judge. This is an image of the distribution of wealth in the United States. In the 1800s, there was a sort of equality in the number of people who had money. And what I mean by that is, say there was $100, 50 of those dollars went to the richest 10%, and 50 of those dollars went to the other 90%. So it's not exactly an equal system, to say the least. However, if you look at 60 years later in 1860, the richest 10% now has 8 out of the $10, and the other 90% only has $2. So it's become even more unequal. And this is the wealth in the United States in that 60-year period. It'd be interesting to see what these scales are today, but I have a feeling it's much closer to this than to this. Even though this is not exactly equal in any means, it's much better than the richest 10% owning 80% of the wealth. And I think it's more like the richest 10% own more like 90% of the wealth in the United States. Image just goes to show, on top you see the very wealthy who are reclining and eating fancy, and then down below you see the poor laborers who are barely struggling. They look like they're half dead, and they're being used and punished in the mines. You see there's people working in the mines here, and it's just a kind of a show to see the discrepancy between capital and labor, the business owners and the workers, and the young people who are suffering tremendously because of this. The people on the bottom look very hollow and sad looking, and the ones on top are well dressed and have servants and are having a jolly old time. Okay, so some of the other things that were invented in the Industrial Revolution. James Watt made the first reliable steam engine, and this was around 1775, and this was used for a lot of different things, starting with cotton production machines and then the first steam engine boat, which allowed people to ride upstream and across ocean waters in a much safer and faster way. And we're also, of course, talking about steel machines, and steel is very strong, so these are very sturdy and powerful, and they can move faster. And there are additionally the first train was called the Rocket, and it went a whopping 15 miles an hour, which I think is hilarious. And this is in 1815, and by 1845 England had 6,000 miles of rail, and trains went about 60 miles an hour. The United States, from California to Maine, on the complete opposite side of the United States, is about 3,200 miles. So this went back and forth across the United States. But if you think about the size of England, it's very impressive when we saw that map with the railroad all over the place in England. Very impressive. This is a scale that shows the amount of railroad lines in Europe, and you can see Great Britain has the most pretty quickly by 1850, and other places in Europe follow pretty closely behind, but not quite what Britain has. Germany comes in second, and then France. Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, which took cotton out of the plants and pulled it into usable bundles of cotton that would be turned into thread. And he also invented interchangeable parts for muskets, which led to interchangeable parts for other machinery, which meant if one thing broke on a machine, it could still be used, just that one part would be replaced, which is really useful for machines in general. The telegraph by Samuel Morse, who also invented Morse code, very helpful for secrets during wars. An early Kodak film camera was invented. The transatlantic cable was invented in the mid-1800s, and that allowed information to travel and news to travel across oceans, which is unreal to think about. And then Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone in 1876. Really nice to be able to communicate without sending a letter that would take 3 or 4 weeks to get somewhere. Thomas Edison, the light bulb, the first long-lasting incandescent light bulb. Really important because prior to this, what did people light their houses with when the sun went down? Candles. Candles burn. What are houses made out of? Wood. There are lots of fires where full cities end up burning down because everything is made of wood, and old wood that gets dry, and then a candle falls and boom, everything is gone. And we don't have social services of firefighters, so it's private companies, and if you haven't paid a private company to help save your house, they won't, and your house would burn down. Nikola Tesla, the first induction electric motor. The Wright brothers invented the first airplane in the early 1900s. This is 100 years ago, people. This is crazy to think about. And then Henry Ford invented the T Ford, the first Model T, and a large-scale moving assembly line. There were assembly lines prior to this, as we recall, with the cottage industry in Britain and in other parts of the world, but this is the first time there's a large-scale moving assembly line with lots of little parts, and each person has one role to quickly change or do one tiny part of a big project. Okay, just to touch upon industrialization in the United States, there are a few main factors. There was explosive growth in the late 1800s and early 1900s. This was thanks in part to access to resources from the Americas and from Europe, European capital. All the things that make money came quickly to the United States. And so the United States saw really rapid growth and process of industrialization. However, importantly, the Americans ended up developing a self-sustaining investment system and soon didn't need to rely on foreign investment at all. By 1914, by the start of World War I, the United States produced over a third of the world's industrial output. That's huge for one nation to create and produce more than a third of the world's industrial goods. The United States had also very pro-business legislation. Government support was essential to this spectacular growth. Land grants that gave businesses land to work on, plus low taxes for business owners, and a tolerance or even encouragement of monopolies. A monopoly is when one company owns all of the product and is the only company to sell that product. They can raise the prices as much as they want, and the government definitely tolerated and allowed this. And this allowed massive industrial creation and huge profits and tons of products that were sold not only in the United States but globally. And in addition, there was mass production for a mass market. Americans pioneered new technologies and techniques of mass production, including, as we just talked about, the assembly lines. And there were methods of mass marketing like mail order catalogs. Today we don't really need those. It's online ordering for most of us. But back in the day, the Sears catalog was delivered to someone's home, and they could look through it and say, I would like this frying pan, or even when it was invented, a washing machine, which was an incredible time-saving, amazing device that people appreciated in ways that today we don't really appreciate until our washing machine breaks, or if we live in an apartment and we have to walk down the block to go wash our clothing, which is a humongous pain in the rear, but still a machine does it. We don't have to hand wash anything. That's incredible. And it all came to us based on a catalog, which was a really incredible invention for mass marketing. Also, urban department stores. People could go to a store and get a whole bunch of different stuff in the same place, similar to like today's Target or Costco, something like that. And this also helped create a quote-unquote culture of consumption. And this is similar as to what was going on in England and in Europe with middle-class women who were their role was to consume, to become consumers. And that definitely influenced people across the globe, and especially in the United States, because the United States was sort of a little England in some ways, built off of British influences. And so this was just a really big mass consumption market. And this came with perceptions. And a big perception in America was that it is and was the land of opportunity. And part of that was because of people like Ford, Carnegie, and Rockefeller, who became cultural icons or cultural heroes. They were free of Europe's aristocratic prejudices. They weren't built on old money. They were self-made. They made their own. And they were hailed as industrialist heroes who embodied an entrepreneurial spirit with hard work in the land of opportunity. And of course, difficult working and living conditions persisted in America. The industrial working class faced really hard lives, long hours in factories. They were cramped and housed in really very messy and overpopulated tenements, which is like an apartment building built for 10 families, but 40 families were living there. And because of the lack of old wealth, namely wealth that was inherited, and because there was hope for fortune based on hard work, there was no real development of socialism in America. In addition, the idea of independence and the dislike of big government in America also was part of the push against socialism. And also there was a lot of lack of class solidarity. There were higher living standards in America, especially compared to anywhere else in the world. And there was a white-collar middle class that was growing. White-collar meaning people not doing hard labor or blue-collar work, but white-collar like teachers and doctors and lawyers, things like that. But there were really tense relations between the classes. There were unions that existed, but they were in some ways elitist, focusing on skilled laborers rather than unskilled workers who worked in factories. And there were major racial and ethnic and religious tensions, especially amongst immigrants and minority groups, and amongst the diverse American labor force, with people of different ethnicities and backgrounds and abilities. Strikes were allowed, but many of them became very violent, with state militias and federal troops being called in to stop the strikes. And many situations led to strikes being stopped and strikers, including young women, being beaten up by police officers who were siding with big businesses. But that's part of why the American capitalist system worked, was because the laborers had very little rights. So the American labor force and socialism really failed to organize and unite as a political party, but there were some influences that they had on the people, which we'll talk about in just a second. There were so many workers' challenges during the Industrial Revolution, and this is just a very quick review with some more information. So again, there were no worker protections, there was no insurance, no medical insurance, no workers' comp, no rights for the workers. So if someone was being beaten up, they couldn't complain, they would just be fired. And there were super dangerous conditions with not enough lighting and locked doors, things like that. Very unhealthy conditions for work. Huge punishments and abuses. Low pay leading to extreme poverty where people had to share homes with many other people. There wasn't enough food. People weren't eating 3 meals a day. And part of this also was rapid urbanization, meaning cities that grew overnight practically, and there was so much overcrowding and such a great lack of sanitation. I'll show you some pictures in a moment. It's horrifying to think about. Plus the very, very long days and hours and very demoralizing labor. You're screwing on one piece of a part of something. You don't ever see the outcome. It's very hard on the body, very boring, and very demoralizing. It's hard on someone if they don't have pride in what they're doing. It's very challenging to continue doing that every day for the rest of your life. Plus toxic water and open sewage systems and toxins that dripped into rivers that people drank from and went into the wells, and there was garbage everywhere with too few refuse places, and it wasn't being picked up, and so there's just garbage everywhere, and oh my goodness, how disgusting. Food was rotten on a regular basis. In 1865 in New York, for example, decayed and diseased food were often sold to the working classes, which of course left them in a weakened state, because if you're eating diseased and rotten food, you're not going to feel very good. And here's a quote: "Much of the food sold was unfit for human sustenance, unwholesome meat, piles of pickled herrings, which are fish, are exposed to the air until mass approaches a condition of putridity, and this slimy food with wilted and decayed vegetables, sausages, etc., whose digestion no human stomach can accomplish, all find ready purchasers in that working class, and these food remains are daily entombed in the protuberant stomachs that are really, really big, of thousands of children who are starving, pallid, expressionless faces, and shrunken limbs from being so hungry. These are familiar attributes of childhood." And that quote came from the report of the Council of Hygiene and Public Health of the Citizens Association of New York in 1865. And all of these things led to a huge increase in diseases and extremely high mortality rates. The life expectancy in some cities was less than 20 years of age. People died on average under age 20. 3 out of 5, or more like 6 out of 10 children died by the age of 5. What an insane time and place to live. The huge increase in diseases, again, was due to undernourishment and lack of sanitation and hygiene. People didn't really understand that they had to wash their hands. And so they would go to the bathroom and dig in dirt. And if they were doctors, they might work on cadavers, dead people, and then go to deliver babies and do operations without ever washing their hands. So this was both hygiene and sanitation that was personal for individuals and in hospitals and workplaces, etc. Plus bacteria grew in the water and food, and due to the sewage systems, there wasn't refrigeration, things like that. And these bacteria led to horrible diseases. Just to name a few: cholera, dysentery, typhus, scurvy, hospital gangrene, meaning you go into the hospital for something and you have a little infection, and because the hospitals were dirty, people got gangrene and then had to have limbs removed. Diphtheria and pertussis, which is also known as whooping cough, and scarlet fever, which is group A strep. And all of these things led to death, led to extremely high mortality rates in the populations of industrialized nations. Another example is called puerperal fever, and this happened to women after they gave birth to babies. Huge percentages died because doctors did not wash their hands or the instruments that they were working on. And for example, in Austria, in Vienna, in one hospital, 32% of women who gave birth died in 1847. And there was a Viennese physician, an Austrian physician named Semmelweis, who provided proof of the cause of this fever. He said that chances are it was because doctors weren't washing their hands or instruments after dealing with other people, like infectious people with other diseases, or going to the cadaver dissection lab and then straight to the maternity ward without washing their hands. So in 1847, he ordered in his hospital hand washing and chlorinated water before delivering babies. And surprise, surprise, the mortality rate from child bed fever, which is another name for puerperal fever, declined to 0. Out of over 1,000 cases, nobody died because doctors washed their hands. What a shock. And here's an even more interesting little twist. In 1865, so less than 20 years later, Dr. Semmelweis was deceived into entering an insane asylum because other doctors didn't want to hear his nonsense and were angered by his findings that their hands might be dirty. They were offended by that. So he was basically deceived into entering an insane asylum, and he tried to escape, and the guards beat him so bad that they cut his hands open and other wounds, and eventually it led to gangrene and death within a couple of weeks for this doctor who was trying to help women from dying after giving birth. Pretty interesting. The ego, what the ego does for people. This is an image of a public hall and sink, and as you can see, the floor is covered in fecal matter, which is poop, and sewage, and this is in 1903. And this is a water closet or a bathroom that was used by 14 families in 1916. 14 families used this one toilet. And as you can tell based on the picture, it's freaking disgusting. And I would prefer to go outside than to use this toilet. But of course, outside is city. Where are you going to go in the city? This is an image of Syracuse, New York. And these shanties, these little houses, backed to an open sewer. This is a sewer area. Sewer. With all sorts of human excrements and garbage and toxic waste. And this is 1901. I could just imagine kids playing, and oh, the ball gets thrown and lands in the sewer, and you don't know any better, so you go to fetch your ball out of the sewer, and you don't know how to wash your hands, because that's not something that people are told to do, and you end up dying from one of those godforsaken diseases. This is a Chicago alleyway in 1901, and also, as you can see, it's covered in garbage. There are manure boxes from stables that had farm animals right in the city, and lots of just garbage because there were no receptacles to put garbage in, and no one picked up the garbage on a regular basis. So what did people do? They threw it out the window, and this is what it looked like. Could you imagine the smell? Oh my goodness, it's just, I kind of want to throw up just thinking about it. Eventually, new inventions and work systems started to help worker health. And if you think about it, the wealthy people didn't live in a place like this. They didn't deal with this. Wealthy had nice mansion homes in the suburbs, away from the city, away from all of this disgustingness. I didn't have to deal with that. So when we're dealing with new inventions and work systems to help the workers, we're talking about the proletariat, as Marx would put it. The masses of people, the laborers, almost all of us are part of this worker-laborer group, the proletariat. Finally, they developed sewer systems. Hooray! And this is the late 19th century through the early 20th centuries, so the late 1800s. Finally, they're discovering covered sewer systems, but as we just saw, it wasn't until well into the 1900s, well into the 20th century, that covered sewer systems became a regular thing. And indoor plumbing, water in a faucet, in a sink, and in a bathtub, where people could actually wash their hands after dealing with something messy like a dirty diaper or going to the bathroom or dealing with raw meat. And they could wash their hands and bathe on a regular basis. And indoor toilets. So you didn't have to share with 14 other families. I don't even want to share with my husband, let alone 14 other families. And there was also, thanks to the pressure from unions and strikes, the government eventually stepped in to help workers in minor ways that really were actually very major. And people were allotted more time to eat, and more nutritious food became available, especially towards the 1940s and 1950s and beyond. And government regulations on businesses also improved situations. So the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, was established to help keep toxins out of rivers and air so that people could breathe clean air and could drink clean water that wasn't filled with toxic, disgusting waste. Unions were finally legalized, and welfare programs were developed to help people who lost their job or became injured on the job. And insurance was established, both medical and workers' comp insurance. So if you were hurt on the job, the business owner would help you out, and so you wouldn't starve to death and your family wouldn't starve to death. How interesting. This is something I think we generally take for granted if we have full-time jobs with insurance. And even part-time work, you're still covered based on workers' comp. Business owners have to pay for that. There were also reduced work hours from 16-hour days to maybe 12 or 10-hour days. Now it's 8-hour days or 40 hours a week. And there are ways to get around that by giving people salaries. But in general, if someone is an hourly worker, they're only allowed to work 40 hours a week, or they have to get more pay. And pay was increased eventually. We have minimum wage. Not every state in America has this, or they do, but their federal minimum wage is different than state minimum wages. And it's not a living wage. It doesn't help a family of 4 survive on one income anymore, but it is helpful nonetheless. And all of these things led to really increased health and a major reduction in diseases. How surprising, not. Let's look at a couple charts. This is a chart that shows the reduction in diseases from 1861 to 1970. So a century of diseases. And you can see 1861, right maybe 60, 70 plus years as after the beginning of the Industrial Revolution across the globe, 100 years, say, in some parts of the globe like Britain, hugely high rates of diseases. Out of 100,000, these are the numbers of people who died. So 100 people maybe had diphtheria or typhoid and died of these diseases. And then the numbers dropped. So by the time we have an invention of covered sewer systems, it's starting to really dramatically drop. And by the time most homes have indoor plumbing and sewer systems, and people are eating better meals, at least 3 meals a day, maybe not the most nutritious, but definitely more food per day, the number of diseases drops to almost 0 out of 100,000 for smallpox, measles, typhoid, and diphtheria, and only TB is still hanging around until the almost 1970s, but barely, if you look at the numbers of people out of 100,000. And this is a chart that shows in Australia what was going on, measles and scarlet fever. So the measles is the dotted line, and there are high rates during the Industrial Revolution when people are moving to cities, they're open sewers, they're not eating enough, they're not resting enough. And then by the early 1900s, these numbers of both measles and scarlet fever dropped dramatically. So out of 100,000 people, maybe 10 end up dying. And down to the 50s, it's almost nothing. And down here by 1965, there are no people dying from measles and scarlet fever in Australia. Out of 100,000 people, none. And then this is when the measles vaccine is introduced, which is kind of interesting to think about. Why they would introduce a vaccine when there was almost none of the disease left, based on increased nutrition and rest and sewer systems and cleanliness, hygiene. And then one more chart. This is deaths from pertussis, which is also known as whooping cough. And this is in England or Wales from 1838 till 1979, so around 140 plus years. And you see again, Industrial Revolution, super high rates of pertussis, lots of people are dying, 50 out of 100,000 or so. And then introduction of sewer systems, indoor plumbing, nutrition, strikes leading to better hours. People are sleeping more and resting more and having more fun with their families. And then down here, by 1952, we have maybe a few handfuls of people dying from pertussis. And again, interestingly, the pertussis vaccine became widespread in the 1950s, when there were practically no people dying from this disease, which is really interesting to think about why they would create and enforce widespread use of this vaccine when very few people were dying from it, whereas the vaccines have lots of side effects. Interesting. Okay, so of course not everyone complies with these things. Strikes continue. Unions fight for workers' rights on a regular basis. As an educator, as an instructor, I have to pay dues into a union, which I have decided to join because I think my union is really helpful and helps fight for my rights as an instructor. They're working now to get me paid office hours so that I can get paid for answering emails, things like that. As of now, all of that is for free. I only get paid for quote-unquote classroom hours, for about 3 hours a week per class. And I work probably 20 to 25 hours a week, so my pay is like between $3 and $4 an hour, literally. But my union is doing what it can to improve that in some ways, and to provide things like medical insurance for people who teach enough classes, etc. In 1991 in North Carolina, there was a chicken fire in a chicken factory, and 25 people died. It had been open and operating for 11 years without a single inspection, and the people died because the doors were locked, because the owners of this chicken factory in North Carolina in 1991 did not want people to steal chicken. So here's just one really harsh example of how not everyone complies with the rules. And of course they were shut down after this, but 25 Americans died in 1991 because owners of a chicken factory didn't want people to steal chicken. Holy chickens. And of course, inequality persists. Inequality is a lack of, in this case, economic equality for people. There are severely underdeveloped nations with extremely high poverty rates, people living off of $1 or less a day. I don't even know how people live. I can't imagine going to the grocery store with $1 and thinking, okay, I need to feed myself and my family for a day or a few days with a couple dollars. What would I buy? An apple is more than $1. Maybe if they're on sale, I could get a couple bananas. What would I buy for $1 to help myself live? And that's happening today. There's a lot of emaciation, starvation. And in so many parts of the world, there is no running water. And of course, we know what that leads to. If you don't have running water, there's stagnant, toxic water that people try to drink and they get sick from it. And of course, there are also high pesticides in lots of parts of the world, and people don't have fresh water to wash their fruits and vegetables and end up getting really horrible diseases, high rates of diseases, and high rates of mortality. People die young in a lot of parts of the world today. This is a chart that shows the distribution of wealth in the United States, and this is from 2007, so a decade ago. And what I think is most striking here is the bottom 40% of the population in America holds 0.2% of American wealth. If you include the next highest percentage, the middle 20%, middle class, holds 4%. So the bottom 60% of Americans consume and get 4.2% of American dollars. So that means if there were $100 and 100 people, 60 of them would have to share $4.20. And one person would have $34.60. And the next 4%, so a total of 5% of the population here, would hold $61.9. So $61.90 for 5% of the population, and 60 people would have $4.20 if we broke this into $100 and 100 people. That's a pretty interesting breakdown, and this is just in the United States. And just to touch upon a new way of thinking with science in the 19th century, so the 1800s, we've already talked about a couple of these, but Karl Marx and his colleague Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848, right at the kind of middle high ground of what was going on. They saw a huge struggle between the classes with gross challenges for the proletariat, the working class. And that's why they came up with that idea of communism, or socialism really. And then Darwin, Charles Darwin, the biologist, he wrote a couple things including The Origin of Species and The Development of Man. And these sources, this biologist, he argues that life was constantly changing and evolving, and all forms of life were in a constant struggle with each other over resources. And certain ones would lose the struggle and fail to continue existing. the idea of the evolution in a sense. But this is a very limiting philosophy, that the world is a pie, for example, and everyone wants a bigger slice, and if you don't get a slice, then you're going to die. But the pie of the world is definitely enough to feed everyone many times over, and to clothe and to shelter everyone many times over. The reason it doesn't work is because of greed, and people think that because they have more money or higher education or bigger guns that they should be more powerful and deserving. Kind of a corrupted philosophy on life, if you ask me. And then Freud, just to touch upon this philosopher, he studied psychoanalysis, kind of the father of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud. And he said that physical symptoms that develop in people are manifestations of emotional conflicts. So that people have physical problems like back pain or headaches or diseases because they have challenging emotions, because maybe they were abused as children or their bosses are abusive. I know I've had a couple of horrible bosses, and that caused me a lot of physical agony because I just became so stressed out that my body failed because I had the worst bosses for a few months of my life, and it took me like 10 years to physically recover from them. So that's kind of interesting to think about. And Freud also said that there were primal urges of sexuality and aggression that drive humans, which I think is maybe a sad way of thinking about things, but people can overcome these ideas with training and with positive thoughts, positive thinking. Okay, so our focus question. To answer this question, as always, review the lecture PowerPoint and the assigned textbook reading, Chapter 17, and the primary source documents and images. You should take a look at the list on the syllabus. And review the How to Create a Focus Question outline that can help you in writing your outline. So the focus question, argue. This is where you put your argument. Why was the new philosophy of socialism, which was also known as Marxism, incited, which means provoked? Explain. How did the changes that occurred during the Industrial Revolution, including new inventions, job types, working conditions, living conditions, and health, etc., affect the working class people, the proletariat? So you have to really think about this. Think about so many new things that happened during the Industrial Revolution that affected the working class to the point where this new philosophy of socialism was incited, was provoked. Include in your assessment an evaluation of the Communist Manifesto or the image titled Pyramid of the Capitalist System. You can assess both of these. Also, pick at least one more primary source document and at least one more image to analyze in your arguments. And as always, include the 5 W's. Who was involved? What happened? Where? When? And why? So the why is right up here. This is the why. All of these things that occurred, the new inventions that affected jobs that made people move from rural areas to cities, from great jobs to horrible jobs, to decent working conditions to horrible working conditions, and living conditions, living on top of each other, filled with diseases, health declined, depression grew, etc. All of these things affected the working class people, and eventually socialism arose with the idea that everyone should rise up together and the government should be there to support the people, not the bosses, not the owners, but the workers. The workers are the ones that hold up the world. So there you have it. Hope you enjoyed this lecture.